Okay, great. So a couple people had mentioned wanting to listen to the recording after, so we can share the link afterwards. So welcome everyone to our discussion of Gilbert Simondon's Individuation in the Light of Notions of Form and Information, which we're starting today. I can explain a little bit how we've been doing it for some people that maybe this is their first time joining. I think it's the same way that some of the other reading groups have been proceeding, but we've just been reading one paragraph at a time, going around different people reading and then discussing each paragraph and trying to unpack the meaning. And feel free to put questions or comments or links or whatever in the chat if you have them. And also feel free to get on the mic. It might be a little bit more, because we have more people this time, we might need to be a little more structured in terms of the voice discussion, but we'll see how it goes to start with. But yeah, so we'll just read through it and comment as we go along. And yes, the link to the PDF is in the discussion chat. It's also in the other channel, the ongoing discussion channel. I pinned it there in case you don't have it. 2.5 minute rule. Is that the length of someone's intervention? You're only allowed to speak for 2.5 minutes, or what is that?
I was half joking, but I was saying like if we're as a rule of thumb, maybe if people are going on for a while, we can just kind of say like try and keep it under a certain amount of time or something.
Yeah, I think I don't know if we need a sort of firm limit, but because we have more people, try to, I guess, make your intervention brief so that everyone has a chance to speak. And I will try to do the same as well. But I'm also sort of leading this group because it's something that I've read before, so I can try to help guide. But I will try to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. Okay, so we're starting with the Foreword by Jacques Garelli, which is actually, it's in the French edition, but I had never read it before for whatever reason. So I just read it today. And so we can go through it and discuss some of the points it brings up. But we should also keep in mind that some of the ideas that are developed or alluded to in this foreword are not going to make a lot of sense until we actually get to the book itself. So we'll have to, in a few instances, we'll probably have to wait to have a full discussion of some concepts until we get to them in the book. But that being said, I will start reading, and then we can go around the table and have a few other people read.
Nan, before we begin, just to clarify, are we reading the foreword or are we starting with the introduction?
The Foreword by Jacques Garelli.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. So, Introduction to the Problematic of Gilbert Simondon, the Philosophical and Scientific Horizon of the Method. If it has been noted that this work is paradoxically situated at the confluence of a meditation inspired by the Ionian physiologists on the notion of physis, Anaximander's thought on the unlimited apeiron, Plato's thought on the one and the indefinite dyad of the Aristotelian and substantialistic, atomistic, hylomorphic principle of Leucippus and Democritus, and moreover, the most recent theories of thermodynamics, quantum physics, and information. It has rarely been emphasized that the individual and its physical biological genesis was dedicated in memory of Maurice Merlot Pont. This is an essential guiding thread, at least if the memory implies recognition and is therefore faithful in its recollection. Of what? Of the Merleau-Pontian thought of the pre-individual and its ties to individualizing formations, of its invitation to contemplate the pre-Socratic thought of the element, of its critique of Gestalt theory, of hylomorphic dualism, and symmetrically of the materialist atomism developed by several currents of contemporary psychology, and lastly, of a radical critique of nothingness and the dialectic, in the sense that this notion and this procedure manifests a sort of reverse positivism of negation that steers philosophy away from the pre-individual dimension of the world.
I mean, one thing I think we can say before we start digging into at least what he means by terms such as pre-individual or genesis or individual itself. I think one thing we can sort of say as a sort of biographical antidote was that Simone Don, I'm pretty sure, was a student of Merlot Pont, if I remember correctly. So they did have a big influence on at least the way he understood his thought.
Yeah, that's right. He did work with Merlot Pont, and I should also mention, just as a sort of orientation to this book, it has a bit of a strange publication history. So this was Simone Don's habilitation thesis, and so the first part was published in 1960, I believe, and then the second part was published separately in 1989, and then it was only in 2005 that the whole thesis was published in French, and then now we're reading the translation of that whole thesis. So in this paragraph, the reference is made to the individual and its physical biological genesis. So that's the title under which the first part was published in the 60s, and that's the one that was dedicated to Merlot Pont.
Yeah, I have one question about the so these in France, right? The habilitation dissertation or something is what you do before you get your professorship or tenure. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I'm not like sort of an expert on the French system, but my understanding is that yes, you work in the lycée level, like the sort of a late high school level, I guess, for a few years while you're preparing your habilitation thesis, and then once you've defended your habilitation, you have to do a major and a minor thesis, and so this was the major thesis, and then the minor thesis was the book on the mode of existence of technical objects, and then after you defend your habilitation thesis, you are allowed to teach at the university level. So if we look maybe to the meaning of this passage now, so that first long sentence is sort of alluding to each of the different elements or components that Simone Don brings together, especially in the introduction to this book, and that sort of are the guiding principles that he is working from. So the Ionian physiologists and Anaximander, those are more dealt with in the complementary text to this book, which is also in the translation, which is called History of the Notion of the Individual. But in the actual book itself, there isn't too much discussion of that. But the next one's Plato's thought of the one and the indefinite dyad of the large and small. This is something that is one of the reference points in the introduction and the sort of general orientation of the book. This is going to be recaptured in the idea of differences of scale. So in an individuation process, there's a linking between the micro and macro scales, or different scales of the system are linked to each other through the process of individuation. And this is something we'll see more of when we get to the actual introduction of the book itself. But just to give you a taste of what's coming, I guess. And then the main targets of the criticism in the introduction are the hylomorphic theory of Aristotle, so the form and matter ontology, and then the atomistic theory of Leucippus and Democritus. So the theory that holds that bodies are composites of atoms in the void. So those are the two theories that he criticizes as not having a proper account of individuation, and we'll see more of what his criticism is as we go on.
I also think that last bit, the critique of nothingness and the dialectic, that'll become important, because it's like another not only for transduction as like a method that is supposed to go beyond like dialectics, but just also if we think about everyone on the server being involved in different groups, but this concept of nothingness and negativity and lack is always coming up, and this feels like yet another kind of way of attacking that and approaching it from like an endlessly kind of generative. I think a word that is used throughout is generative, but anyway, it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I guess. Sorry, was I interrupting?
No, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I mean, I just want to say I think that sort of makes sense because one way to look at the pre-individual then is a state of excess. Because if you look at the potentials, state of excess, that's one way where you can critique lack.
Right. I was just going to mention that there's a notion of transduction that we'll come across later on in this foreword. Is a sort of an alternative to dialectics in one sense. So Simondon, his criticism of the dialectics, or his differentiation of his own procedure from dialectics, is that there's no moment of negation in that procedure of transduction. And so we'll see in more detail what that means exactly. But here, this allusion to the critique of nothingness and the dialectic, I think, so that Garali here is saying that this is something that Simondon borrowed from Merlot Pont, or derived from him. And I think that's referring to I think one of the later chapters in Phenomenology of Perception, where he criticizes Sartre's ontology of being and the nothing. So that's a sort of a general principle in Simondon, or a general theme in Simondon, is this criticism of the concept of negation or of nothingness. And then maybe just a last comment before we move on to the next paragraph. The sort of philosophical positions that he's criticizing, as I mentioned, are the Aristotelian hylomorphic position and the atomistic position. And then he's going to do that on the basis, or using borrowing some concepts from physical sciences. So the concept of potential, which is borrowed from thermodynamics. There's going to be discussion of quantum physics in a later chapter that we'll get to at some point. And then also the theory of information, which was relatively new at the time he was writing, but was an important reference point for his work as well. And he uses these notions to criticize some of the inadequacies of the philosophical positions. All right, would someone else like to read the next paragraph? It's a little bit distorted, but I think we can read it.
I can go. Furthermore, on the methodological plane, there is an attitude shared by Merleau-Pontian phenomenology and the epistemology of microphysics, such as it is stated in Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, according to which we cannot radically separate the scientific object discovered at the end of research from the path of the thought and the operative processes that have led to revealing and constructing it. This attitude is developed with an extreme originality and a personal inflection due to the Simondonian conception of transduction and information that we will have to carefully examine. Moreover, it seems difficult to perceive the problematic of Gilbert Simondon, which, among other things, poses the question on the mode of existence of technical objects as a renewed form of physicalism. The dedication to Merleau-Ponty would therefore make such a positivist attitude of this style rather unexpected.
Can anybody give us a brief background in the reference to Merleau-Ponty?
Yeah, I mean, I'm far from an expert, but as far as I remember from my reading of Merleau-Ponty, there's I think what he's referring to here is a criticism of the criticism of a psychological orientation that takes the physical world as a given, and then sort of adds psychology on top of it in some sense. And for Merleau-Ponty, it's rather that the human body as a part of the world. So the human body is a perceiving body embedded in the world, rather than a sort of Cartesian subject outside of the world and looking at the world. And so this criticism of sort of physicalism that Merlot Pont develops here, Garali is saying that Simondon is sort of working on that basis and is therefore not a physicalist.
Yeah, the interesting thing is also that there is this distinction in Merleau-Ponty of the body as a felt body. I don't know if there's a distinct word for it in English. It's not only a physical body, but it's this lived body, like a form of medium that is between subject and object. So it's not merely sensual in a sense or intellectual or ideal, and on the other side, it is not merely just a deterministic system of atoms, so to speak. It's the felt body that you are moving, and that's part of your identity, that you are feeling, that you live in, and it's this body that is generating also, like in a Bergsonian sense, the pictures that we are interacting with to enable us to have some notion of free will, or to have a choice in specific moments, to have a perspective on things and to have a more distant outlook on the world and not be captured in the flow of causal relations, but to have some sort of agency and intentionality as well.
There's a sort of a lineage from Bergson to Merleau-Ponty and to Simondon. It's sort of a counter lineage, I guess, to the more straightforward phenomenological lineage. But there's definitely a lot of we'll see a lot of resonances with Bergson as we go along through this book.
I think there's. Sorry, go ahead, Lou.
I just want to say, I think the line from Bergson to Simondon is fairly direct. Like Merleau-Ponty and Jean-Hippolyte serve as like mediators for this whole generation to Bergson, but from what I've read in secondary literature, Simondon is usually considered as one of the two big post-Bergsonians with Deleuze together.
Was there someone else who had a comment as well?
No, it's okay. I was just going to say that I think we'll see more of this when we see the discussion of the Sunalon and Aristotle and sort of like Simon's critique of that. But you do get a sense of, I haven't met Merleau-Ponty, but from listening to what you said, Triad, that there's this thing about, which again feels like it connects back to Bergson, of like the body and the individuated, the living being, I guess he calls it, is as like a site of virtual potentials, and that kind of allows it to traverse various traditions, I guess. But I think it'll make more sense when we get to that point.
To ask a question then, and maybe we'll get into this as we go, but because I see it's going to be developed. So maybe we don't have to answer this now, but it sounds like one of the questions being posed right now in the introduction is, what is the relationship of Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology with Simondon's project here?
Yeah, that's definitely in this first part of the foreword. That's definitely one of the sort of reference points. And I mean, as I said, I'm not an expert in Merleau-Ponty, but I tend to feel like maybe this foreword overemphasizes that relationship to some extent. So, I mean, there is this dedication to Merleau-Ponty of the book, but within the book itself, there's no direct reference to his work. I'm pretty sure, and the connection with Bergson probably inspired by Merleau-Ponty or generated by him, but is also more direct, as Lou said. So there's a more direct reference to Bergson than there is to Merleau-Ponty. And I think this thesis that Garelli makes here, that Simondon's work or Simondon's thought is not a physicalism because of the reference to Merleau-Ponty, I think is something I would probably argue that it is a physicalism, but of a different kind than the one that Merleau-Ponty was criticizing. But that's something we can probably think about as we continue to read the book and we get to the introduction.
Mm-hmm. And on the point, how does this relate to phenomenology? It's in the sense that in this method, we are looking strictly to the phenomena that are given to us in a very descriptive and bracketed sense, so to speak, when we look at it through the phenomenological lens of Husserl, who is very oriented on theoretical knowledge and how we can ground our knowledge in a new transcendental way. Then later Heidegger is opening this method of a very accurate description of phenomena and how they are related, how they are given to us in a specific sense. And it's very important not to recur to specific concepts that are already established. So this is this aspect of epoche, that you are trying to bracket out all the pre-assumptions that are going together with a phenomenon. And Heidegger is opening this method more to the world and to aspects of a more essentialist, existential philosophy of death, of time. That's something that is then very much influencing authors like Sartre. And later Merleau-Ponty takes a turn on both Husserl and Heidegger, because he's focusing way more on the body and the relation of body, world, body, soul, and subject and object, just to overcome this typical traditional dichotomy, something that is very present already in Heidegger, but in Merleau-Ponty, the body becomes this intermediate thing between our inner systematic workings, our intensive structure, so to speak, and flows, and the world. So we can just see this more phenomenological approach, very much focusing on for example, perception, but also on the aesthetic feelings of touching something, hearing something, and not trying to push all these phenomena in a conceptual pre-existing framework.
I think it's hard not to undersell Merleau-Ponty's contributions to the development of phenomenology, because by like refocusing the subject to the embodied subject, he was really kind of front-loading any number of spurious, possibly spurious kind of ontological distinctions into the phenomenological project. Anything that previously could have been inferred from kind of embodied experience was kind of taken to be directly relevant to the perceptual real world situation that that cashed out the value for the phenomenological project. So it was kind of like I think a lot of people do kind of think of Merleau-Ponty as someone who is just this asterisk to phenomenological distinctions, sort of, so to speak. There was the kind of framing of scientific phenomenology and the kind of relation to epistemic and kind of previous philosophical notions that Husserl kind of took care of. And then from then there's like different projects. Merlot Pont, he brought the body back into the picture. But I think in doing this, it's really a lot more philosophically implicative than just kind of like coloring in phenomenology with like a proper context because we all happen to be in bodies or something like that. Like it's a lot more interesting, and I encourage everyone to go and read more Merlot Pont.
Right. It's something that I've only read the Phenomenology of Perception. I think I don't think I've read anything else from him, and that was years ago. So it's something I should probably go back to at some point. But I also wanted to raise something that Angus had posted in the chat about physicalism, and so that this sort of dictionary definition of physicalism as the thesis that everything is physical. So it is, in a sense, opposed to the picture of subjectivity as standing outside of the world. But so Merlot Pont criticizes the both at the same time as being sort of the mirror images of each other. So an intellectualist psychology that like Descartes' psychology that focuses on innate ideas as sort of the structuring principles of the mind, and then a straightforward empiricist psychology. They're sort of mirror images of each other in that they each presuppose what the other one is starting from. So each of them sort of lacks what the other starts from, and so they're both inadequate for that reason. And so the physicalism position, or the physicalist position that Garely here takes Simondon following Merleau-Ponty to be criticizing is one that starts from the object, the world as something objective, and takes the subjective to be something outside of it or independent from it in some way, and then so the criticism of physicalism would be, or the counter to physicalism would be a position that takes subject and object to be relative terms in some sense, or to have the subject arise out of the object or something like that. We'll see some different ways of trying to understand that as we get into the introduction.
Would you say also that this could be connected to his sort of thing about elevating the relation to the status of being? Like, and I don't want to go too far ahead here, but I'm just thinking of, if we think about like locating, the importance of the body and like the Synalon type thing, maybe the idea of physicalism that we're talking about here isn't just a kind of base materialism, which could be a lot of different things, but it's physicalism in the sense of the relations that are unfolding in these metastable systems, the problematics that that are being resolved through transduction and all that. They're not; these aren't just like abstract terms that are being related conceptually, but they have a physical is the wrong word, but insofar as there are individuals, individuated beings and things, they exist and they actually resolve themselves and create further systems. And reticular, I think, is the word he uses. Like they create reticular kind of systems. So maybe that's where he's getting at with the idea of it. It's not physicalism in the traditional sense, but it's there's a spatio-temporal kind of like location to what's happening. It isn't just unfolding in empty time, like he critiques later the Hegelian dialectic. It's not just randomly happening in different stages or something.
I would just jump in and say that reminds me a little bit of like Merleau-Ponty's late work, where he talks about the chiasm, right? Where he talks about a kind of intertwining between subject and object, and really there's a sort of like in his some of the last things that he wrote, there's a kind of dissolution between bodies and world that sort of starts from this sort of fleshed ontology, or I think is what he calls it, but then he's really starting to question the boundaries of it. I'm wondering if Simondon's conceptualization of physicalism is somehow is responding to that, is responding to his very late work.
Yeah, for those who've read ahead, there's discussion of the chiasm, or there's use of it at least. It does not sort of well expounded, I don't think, but it sounds, I think, based on the publication history, Simondon probably would not have been would not have had access to the visible and the invisible when he was writing this book. But as Garali is going to point out a little bit later, just through conversation and attending his courses and so on, Simondon would probably have had at least some awareness of what Merlot Pont was doing in this time period, or what he was working on. So yeah, there's probably not a direct line from the visible and invisible, but some awareness of that same thematic, I guess.
Should we, in the interest of time, should we keep reading maybe? And if so, I don't mind reading. I was going to propose maybe reading the next 2 paragraphs to just kind of finish this initial section.
Sure, that sounds good.
If I hope I'm not cutting anyone off. I'm just thinking about time. Yeah, I'll just go ahead. So, on the contrary, what Gilbert Simondon invites us to contemplate and remodel according to a radically new perspective is the strange relation between the pre-Socratic thought of the unlimited and of the element, on the one hand, and that of the Merleau-Pontian style of pre-individual being in its process of individuation, which are linked. And this is the very paradox and barely understood originality of Gilbert Simondon to the thermodynamic conception of metastable systems that are irreducible to the order of identity, unity, and alterity. Such are the stakes of this work, whose force of invention prohibits any attempt seeking to isolate it in a current of thought or that would form a school. If phenomenology can glean something of interest from this meditation, it would be through the questions posed to it, through the course, pathways, bifurcations, and modes of problematization that Simondon's meditation deploys on the horizon of the very questions inherent to the phenomenological enterprise. Furthermore, it is on behalf of the central question of the pre-individual in its process of individuations that we are attempting to grasp the legitimacy of the notions of metastable, system, potential, and energetic tensions of transductivity and information in a thought of the pre-individuality of being.
So that seems to be the author's move here then, right? Is this expounding on the peridots of like a Merleau-Pontian engagement with the pre-individual through consciousness, right? And thereby things like the body and being. But instead to go at it in a different route, which he's comparing with physicalism here, right? That seems to be like the paradoxical move that he's locating in Simondon.
Yeah, I think that's why, for me, I was a little bit skeptical of this claim that Simondon is not doing physicalism or is not a physicalist, because I do think that what we find in Simondon is precisely on account of where this pre-individual element acts within the physical. So you could call it a non-physicalism in the sense that it's not based in an account of bodies, but it's still physical in the sense that the potentials and forces and so on that he's talking about are real, physical forces. So these processes of individuation are not happening in the void; they're happening in the real world. So I think they are physical in that sense.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, because even the author here seems to kind of be wondering about that, right? Like Simone seems to be paradoxically a physicalist, or to say it differently, right? Like the positive attitude of his move here is it's unexpected, right? It seems like he's trying to do something that otherwise you would just go your way and we go our way, right? The criticism would kind of it'd be kind of like a bygones thing, right? You go your way, I go my way. It looks like the theme here is that Simondon's able to take things that seem irresolvable, especially through their critical engagement with one another, and he's able to help them kind of, he's able to create things out of that actually have a way of working together as opposed to just like splitting off.
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding correctly, he like an example of what you're talking about is the way that he criticizes the hylomorphic schema, the form and matter schema, but he does so in a way that shows it, sort of relativizes it, that shows why it might seem to be true in a limited case, but why it's insufficient to describe individuation as a whole. And we'll see a little bit more of that in the next section of this foreword, and then again in the introduction.
Shall we read on?
Yeah, so we can continue. If someone else would like to read the next paragraph.
I can read. Is that on the contrary?
No, we're at below that. So at the title, revaluation of classical concepts and modes of thought. From there.
Okay. In a note from February 1960, Merlot Pont writes, "But what is fine is the idea of talking literally, the erwerken of thought. It is really empty. It is of the invisible. All the positivist bric-a-brac of concepts, judgments, relations is eliminated, and the mind wells up as a water in the fissure of being. We must not look for spiritual things there, are only structures of the void, but I simply wish to plant this void in the visible being, show that this is its reverse side, in particular the reverse side of language." Gilbert Simondon's critique of the principle of individuation, whose corollaries are those of form, matter, substance, and fixed and stable, autonomous terms posited as realities in themselves that form the structure of the world, relations, and inductive and deductive judgments, proceeds in the same critical style as the one recommended by Merlot Pont. In fact, this mutual appeal of Merleau-Ponty and Gilbert Simondon to the radical recasting of philosophical concepts will be articulated through the conscious apprehension of a tightly conjoined movement of being and of thought, a movement, which generates the complex processes of individuations that arise from a trans-individual dimension of being. The striking simplicity of Gilbert Simondon's demonstration from the very first lines of his doctoral thesis should not make us forget all the preparatory work that stems from a profound meditation on the Ionian physiologists, as well as the thought of Plato and Aristotle. Thus, the conclusion of a long historical meditation, followed up by years of teaching and reflection, is what leads to the introduction of the present work. What is the crux of the argument?
Yeah, so thanks for that. Yeah, and we Alio just suggested in the chat there that maybe we can read a couple of paragraphs at a time as we go through, and that seems fine to me if it's okay with everyone else. And then we also had a question from Angus about the term diakin. We have a couple of Germans here in the chat and in the discussion, so maybe one of you could explain that word for us.
So it can mean different things. So erwirken means at one point something like obtaining or effecting, so bringing forth something, or even taking out something to obtain a judgment in this sense. So erwirken means affecting in that sense that something is bringing another thing forth or some new aspect.
Right. Thanks. And I think here in that Merlot Pont passage that's cited there, I think it's a reference to Husserl, possibly. I'm not sure, but that would be something that someone could look up if they're interested in following up that reference.
Just to note as well that footnote 4 answers the question earlier about the visible and the invisible, and it was kind of, I think, to try what Triad was saying. Even though it seemed, I think in the footnote he says, even though it seems to indicate that Simondon had not read the above, we should take care to note that he was clearly aware of the spirit of reform, radical reform of philosophical principles developed by Merlot Pont in his courses and conversations, that he could only confirm his own personal undertaking. There's a bit more there, but I think he's implying, I don't know if there's evidence, but he's implying that maybe Simondon was aware of these concepts, even if he hadn't read the text.
Right. I haven't looked ahead. Are the notes at the end of each section, or are they at the end of the whole book?
At the end of the book.
Okay, so we haven't gotten those scanned yet. So yeah, we can. For those who have the book, they can help us out with the notes whenever there's something useful to bring up. I like it better the way they have it in the French edition here, just at the bottom of the page, so you don't have to hunt for the notes at the end of the book. But yeah, we can just read those in whenever there's something useful.
I have a physical copy of the book now, so I can scan the endnotes and stick them up with the scan.
I pinned a message by Varun. He posted the whole PDF of the book and the all the including material of the second volume as well is in it.
Okay, great. Yeah, I didn't see that, so thank you.
There's also, I don't know if we need to read it out loud necessarily, but the footnote 5 also goes into the text's titled History of the Notion of the Individual, I guess, in French, that was what he's referring to here when he says the profound meditation on the Ionian physiologists. I can try and copy paste that into chat if I can find the thing.
Yeah, so that's another text that's added as a complement to the French edition, and then included in the translation as well in the second volume. So it's a history, basically it's the entire history of philosophy read through the lens of the notion of the individual, and so that was written at the same time or in the same period as this individuation book, and so sort of forms a background to it.
So if I understand this passage correctly, Merlot Pont is getting at, whereas these concepts like judgment, relations, and concepts itself, these appear to be of the empty or the invisible, right? But Merleau-Ponty seems to be saying that the void here, where those where structures like concepts seem to arise from, it's not in the invisible. It's actually part of the visible being, and on the flip side of that, yeah.
I'm not 100% sure about the reading of that, of the Merlot Pont passage. I don't know if someone who knows Merlot Pont better than me might be able to comment on that. But to my understanding, he's sort of rejecting the notions of concepts, judgments, and relations as something positivist and to be criticized, and he's instead posing that what he calls the structures of the void are something that arise within being, within the visible, and I guess that would be something like the chiasm or chiasmus, that is sort of the interlacing of the subject and object.
Yeah, maybe someone who's more familiar with Merlot Pont can expand. I'm reading it as this is another kind of instance of the void, what we think of as the void, kind of like what you were saying, what L.A. Mason was saying before, is not, there's not an actual, like he's saying it's the reverse side of something else. So to what extent, Simone brings this up in the introduction where he's like, there is a kind of negativity that happens in these, like in transduction and in ontogenesis, but it's so distinct from a substantial negativity, like the way we would traditionally think of it, that is it negativity anymore? It's like an immanent force at that point. So it's interesting. I don't know Merleau Ponty as much, but it strikes me like it's, if you say that the void is the reverse side of something else, rather than its opposite, it strikes me like you're giving it the status of being there. And then there's all this stuff about entropy and negentropy, stuff that goes way over my head. But that seems like where it might be going.
Yeah, it sounds like a bit of a critique on this, also this dualism between mind and body, for example, because he's very critical in this passage of this Einwirken of thought, so the forcing of thought or the mind on the body, for example, that brings something forth, like concepts, or is judging and is moving the body, so to speak. So for him, it's way more interconnected, as I understand him, and we just don't look anymore on these empty concepts, like in the way of Schelling, who is critiquing Hegel for his negative philosophy that is just concerned with specific concepts. He wants to bind this to a more positive side, to the genesis of these concepts and of what we are even referring to when we are using this, not only by definitions, but looking to the processes, how these things like concepts of and thought and intelligence even are generated through material processes and in this transductive and pre-individual way. So we don't have this notion of some kind of dualism that we put all these conceptions on top of every physicalist explanation, but that we find a new framework, new explanations that are able to describe all the phenomena that are also material, mental, and no matter of what modality, I would say.
I think that's a really good interpretation of this, because I think that's the move I'm seeing too, is that instead of taking concepts and judgment to kind of come out of the void where we can't see any right where there's an invisibility, if we locate the void with being as the flip side, and here he seems to be suggesting that flip side of being is language, or rather being here is almost being here seems to actually even be identified with language here. But in doing so, right, concepts, judgments, and what is coming out of the void in that sense is happening visibly in relation to being, as opposed to, like you're saying, like in a diametrical contrast with being.
Yeah, and one point on this notion of this criticism of concepts, we'll see a little bit further on in this foreword that Simondon also has a criticism of conceptual thinking as concepts being sort of relative to the already constituted individual. And then a non-conceptual form of thinking, which he calls transductive thinking, is what is required in order to think individuation. And for those who were there in the reading on the mode of existence of technical objects, in the conclusion of that book, he identifies this form of thinking with intuition, which is another Bergsonian term. So intuition or transductive thinking is what is required to have a grasp of individuation.
I don't mind reading the next part.
Yeah, I was just going to say we can go on to the next. So let's see how long maybe you just read a page or so.
Yeah, from the first proposition, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
The first proposition is an ontological characteristic in the sense in which it takes for granted that the individual is the essential reality to be explained. This conviction comes from the primacy accorded to by Aristotle to the individual. I'm not going to try for the Greek. Regarding the question of being qua being, as Simondon asks, why should being in its totality end up integrally in a multiplicity of individuals to be known? Why would the being as such not include a pre-individual dimension? Correlatively, why would the individual, such as it appears, not conserve a dimension of pre-individuality in its dimension of being, which would be somewhat associated and irreducible to what can be thought in terms of the individual? This is a dimension that would never cease to intervene in the formation and evolution of the individual, which afterwards takes on a twofold relative value. With respect to the pre-individual being, from which it proceeds without eliminating, and with respect to itself, insofar as that the individual conserves an associated pre-individual dimension that never stops modeling its future individualizations. If this were the case, the whole quest for the principle of individuation and the very idea of the principle would be reformed. I think I'll just stop there because it's sort of like a bit dense. But what he's saying here, at least, it becomes a little bit clearer, in my opinion, in the introduction, right? That, well, what do these models do? These, so for at least the hylomorphic schema or the substantialist schema, what they do is, well, there's two problems in this, that they start with a sort of, well, we need to explain the individual and then work backwards. So what they do to find essentially individuation is they start from like, for example, the hylomorphic schema will start from a fully constituted individual, and then it'll work backwards, whereby it presupposes a teleology. And in the other case, it also presupposes that there's something before individuation itself, that there's that before the process there is something. And I think the heart of Simondon's critique is to basically tackle with those two ideas that these theories presuppose. One, that there's a strict teleology, and two, that there is something before the process.
Yeah, I think you're spot on about that. If we expand on that point too, right, that has a lot of implications for how we're conceiving being, right? Where he writes, as Simondon asks, why should being in its totality end up integrally in a multiplicity of individualities to be known? Right. So, in this point, like if we place everything under the locus of individuality, right, then that means being at this point has no. This is, I guess, expounding on that Merlot Pont quote, right? It has no sort of creation or afterwards, right? It's all about the individualities and not about kind of what they can do or how they've done what they've done, if they've done anything, right?
Yeah, and you see the whole critique of teleology also in the whole notion of a pre-individual state, because, well, what is a pre-individual state? It's a metastable, so it's filled with these potentials and not end goals, really. I don't know how else to respond to that.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to mention a point of translation that I think we'll probably come across throughout the book, especially in the introduction, is the word being. And this is always a little bit difficult to translate across languages. So in this case, the question is whether you want to translate, so in French it's l'être, and the question is whether you want to translate as being or the being. Either one is defendable, but you have to sort of know from the context which one makes the most sense. So there are some cases where it'll be translated as being, and other places where it'll be translated as the being. Yeah, I'm interested to see as we go along which one gets picked where. And so there may be occasions as we go along where I'll sort of point out, an alternate translation.
I think that to be is to be a bound variable, right? Don't we all agree on that?
Right, that's the Quine definition, right?
Yeah, I'm just joking around. It's interesting, though. Yeah, no, I've always been curious about the way that being is translated, and I can spend hours sometimes just kind of going into etymological distinctions, trying to figure out like what. There's even like the problem of the meaning of like cross language meaning, where like there could be like a certain meaning derived from two different independent meanings in two different language sets, I don't know. I'm always really confused by issues of translation, basically.
Yeah, so I think we can go on to the next couple of paragraphs. So we're still going through the first presupposition, and then we'll get to the second one in a couple of paragraphs on the next page, I believe. So maybe you can read up until the line, the second presupposition, if someone else would like to read the next bit.
I can read. Indeed, we should recall that Duns Scotus writes his treatise on the principle of individuation concerning a theological problem, that of the distinction between angels and persons. This work involves a problematic that develops within the framework of a metaphysical discussion that is subordinated to Aristotelian logic and guided by hylomorphic dualism and the theory of four causes. Thus, starting from question 1 of Ordinatio to distinction 3, part 1, which is entitled whether material substance is individual or singular of itself, i.e. from its nature, Duns Scotus expresses himself in the following terms. As to the third distinction, one must ask about the distinction of persons in angels. But to get a view of this distinction in angels, one must first inquire about the distinction of individuals and material substances. And just as different people speak differently about these distinctions, so they speak in different ways about the plurality of individuals in the same species of angels. However, the second question manifests the substantialistic origin of the discussion and the objection that Aristotle addresses to Plato. It is stated in these terms. For the affirmative, in Book 7 of the Metaphysics, philosophy established against Plato that the substance of each thing belongs to that of which it is substance and does not belong to anything else. The logical and metaphysical processes of the discussion, along with the thought of substance, which is never called into question, need to be critiqued for the problem of individuation to be posed.
Yeah, there's a point here before we get into sort of the meaning of this passage. There's one point where I think there's a mistake of translation, but I would want to defer to someone who knows scholastic philosophy a lot better than I do. But where in the translation it says the distinction between angels and persons, I think it should be the distinction of angels into persons. because I think, if I remember correctly, the problem that Duns Scotus is dealing with is, so given that angels consist solely of form, they don't have a matter. What is it that individuates one angel from another, or that distinguishes one angel from another? So how is it that one angel is a distinct person from another angel if there's no matter to individuate them? And so I think it should be distinction between, or sorry, the distinction of angels into persons.
This is the famous how many angels can you fit on the head of the pin? Because if materiality is important for understanding the individuation of angels, then that seems to be very relevant. Like where do we draw the line? Can we fit millions of angels in the size of like one tiny pin? And this isn't a Scotus's thing, but it's just one of those many scholastic strange things. I think there is a strange assumption at this time that there was like an unindividuated angelic substrate, right? Which I find very weird, and I don't think that would be a prevailing notion today, possibly, because we kind of think of angels as these already having some discrete bodies, despite their possible immateriality, which I think most people would probably ordinarily consider angels to be immaterial as well. But this kind of intermediate stage between the divine and the human, I think, is really what is alluded to in these characterizations and these kind of somewhat historical and theological debates.
Yeah, I think just looking at that first point from Duns Scotus, right, he's raising the question of if there is this substance, right, how is it possible that many people are talking about many different substances or have many different takes on the substance, right? Shouldn't there kind of be a consistency there, especially if you have that substantiality, right? So how are you getting difference of substance? And then the second one seems to be, so philosophy established against Plato that the substance of each thing belongs to that of which it is its substance and does not belong to anything else, right? So substance here would be in the thing and shouldn't be coming from anything else, right? It should kind of be sort of inherent there. So the two premises that seem to be being called into question are, why is substance not consistent, and does substance actually abide in the thing as opposed to coming from something, right? Does it have an origin, or is there a process from which it can result?
Yeah, and I think this is connected to the whole critique of, even at one point he says, this is like how you can't reconstruct the world from monads. Like whether you go by the substantialist or the hylomorphic approach, kind of like Vern said, you're always starting, this paragraph said at the beginning, why start with the individual? How do they phrase it? That the individual is the essential reality to be explained. And then using other individuals to explain that individual reality, it's kind of recursive and goes on forever. So I think what's interesting from, I've only read as far as the introduction, but he kind of is trying to do away with form and substance, form and matter and substance, and come up with an entirely different schema, because there's always a problem trying to use, like Vern said, I guess, just starting from this a posteriori and going backwards. But he comes up with other concept there, the a presente, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, I don't think I have a coherent point there. I think more of it will come.
Yeah, I've never been able to really get down to the bottom of the problem of substance and substantiality. I'm always more comfortable with the essences and accidents of Aristotelian designations, but when it comes to substance, I always ponder it for a while and then I delegate it to a constitutional problem of like very holistic character, rather than one in which there's like a direct attribution which would be subject to a vicious circular critique, I guess.
Yeah, I think the Constitution, like the whole Constitution thing is the right way to frame it, because I mean, we're talking about something where being is given by itself and its own unity is given in its own formation, really. So, I mean, the paradox that Simone is aware of is that, well, if substantialism is this thing where we just have, well, we have this being that's sort of it's self-given, its unity, and it's self-constitutive of itself. For some reason, even and despite it being a monism, for some reason it shares a lot of similarities with a hylomorphic thought as well. In that, well, matter and form, well, we can't explain sort of that, so we have to also kind of treat them as substances in a weird way.
Yeah, there's a quote from page 4 where he says something along the lines of the idea that becoming is different than being is only possible within a doctrine that supposes that the model of being is substance. And I think that kind of forms a lot of the like guiding principle for this of like you're always falling into different ways of thinking about stability, things at rest, and then how is it that they become other things. So then you have to explain becoming and being as though they're these two separate things, where he's, you know, he wants to talk about becoming as a dimension of being itself, and therefore it doesn't need, it's not a you know, form and matter hylomorphic thing where something needs to be applied to something else in order for change to happen. And it's also not a series of discrete, you know, individual entities that are randomly collected and somehow magically are moved into another state, which actually reminds me a lot of Bergson's critique of, you know, immobility and immobile ways of thinking, and of you know, spatialized time and stuff. So there's a, I guess again we are kind of jumping ahead, but this is, I think this is the becoming always draws on the pre-individual, and so the pre-individual state never goes away even when individuation happens. So that's why and I think in the intro he does a really good job of explaining why this insight from thermodynamics and metastable systems is so useful for this methodology, because once you get away from the need to talk about things at rest and you're allowed to conceive of tensions resolving themselves as actually inherent to the metastable state, and that it's necessary for problematics to be resolved, then you stop kind of caring about whether, you know, it's all part of the same process, I guess, is to put it crudely.
And I think maybe one last point before we move on to the next paragraph and the second presupposition is that in that last short paragraph after the quote, so Gavelli notes here that the metaphysical and logical processes of the discussion have to be critiqued at the same time as soon as you pose the problem of individuation, and so this is an important point of method for Simone Don, because when he talks about transduction, this is an ontological and a logical process at the same time. So transduction is a real process that is occurring in the world, but it's also through transduction that we can grasp the process of individuation. So it's a mode of thinking and a mode of existence at the same time. So I think maybe I can read the next one. So I'll read this one is a long paragraph. So I think I'll just read the one paragraph and then we'll stop there and discuss. The second unquestioned presupposition is that individuation has a principle that would be anterior to it and would allow for the formation of the singular individual to be explained. The fact that this three-dimensional hierarchical structure, the individual, individuation, principle of individuation, is polarized by an unquestioned ontological privilege granted to the individual, which constitutes the ultimate finality of research, is aggravated by the fact that the quest for the principle of individuation as such derives from a paralogism that crystallizes into the twofold nature bestowed upon the principle. In this sense, two historical attitudes pursue this false path. The first, which is substantialist, atomist, and monist, discovers in the atom of Leucippus and Democritus, the absolute elementary principle that allows for an explanation of the formation of the individual and of the individuated universe. The theory of the Kleineman and Epicurus explains the fortuitous formation of more complex individuated structures based on the unitary atom. Despite the caveats of Bohr and Heisenberg, modern atomistic materialisms that continue to conceive of quantum particles as infinitesimal first substances with an autonomous reality qua formation of matter follow the path of this same illusion. The paralogism consists in conferring upon the already individuated atom the status of a principle that is supposed to explain the very formation of the individual as such. In other words, in a contradictory way, the individual is elevated to an object of research while also being taken as a principle of its own explanation. But the dualistic hylomorphic attitude of the Aristotelian style hardly escapes from the same contradiction, since the form and the matter, insofar as they are conditions and principles of the formation of the synolon, are in fact treated as unitary terms, already individuated causes. However, it is not enough to explain that it is exclusively by abstraction and a posteriori that these principles can be extracted from the single concrete reality that the synolon is, for, on the one hand, they are elevated to supreme and therefore principal and primary metaphysical causes. But on the other hand, Gilbert Simondon's novelty is to demonstrate, through concrete examples borrowed from the formation of natural individualities, such as islands in a river, sand dunes under the pressure of the wind, ravines hollowed out by water streams, and the formation of crystals, but also through technological examples, like the fabrication of a brick or the cutting of a tree trunk, that the formation of a natural or technical individual never ends up in the application of a form to a matter. The hylomorphic schema certainly leaves out the energetic conditions of form taking, which reside in the already deposited energetic conditions in the structure of matter, that natural conditions due to chance or manpower can unleash, orient, and channel in the formation of an individual. Conversely, at the end of the half chain of form taking, there is no structuring form that does not depend on a certain material structure of the form that allows for the potential energy included in the form to structure matter. This is an extremely complex problem that renders the hylomorphic principle of individuation obsolete. However, on the plane of artistic creation, i.e. the formation of material individualities which, through the assemblage of their structure, provoke thought, it can be shown that the formation of a poem, which in its individuality is irreducible to another poem, the formation of a painting, or the formation of a statue never involves a monistic or hylomorphic principle of individuation. But it does involve a process of differentiation that develops from a field of pre-individual tensions and constitutes the metastable horizon of the world of the work. Thus, the quest for the hylomorphic principle of individuation, be it atomistic, substantialistic, or dualistic, it led to the contradiction of seeking, within the individual already formed in atoms or particularized according to the fixed terms of a form and of a matter raised into causes, what would precisely have had to explain the formation of the individual as such. This situation leads Simondon to pose the following questions. Can individuation be conceived as without principle, since it is itself a process intrinsic to the formations of individuals, which are never completed, never fixed, never stable, but always accomplishing in their evolution an individuation that structures them, without these individuals fully eliminating the associated charge of pre-individuality that constitutes the horizon of the trans-individual being from which they stand out? Right, so there's a question in the chat from Angus, so asking, is the argument here begging the question? The argument against the atomistic position, yes, I think it is that the atomistic position is begging the question. So in order to explain individuation, it has recourse to atoms which are themselves already individual. So it explains the individual in terms of something that is already individuated. So it's presupposing what it's supposed to prove. So yeah, I think that's right.
For those of us in Bergson, I'll try not to always, but it really does feel. I was joking in the Bergson chat that it feels like transduction is basically an expansion on the idea of intuition. But whereas Simondon's imagery, he's often focusing on things like this crystals, stuff like that. And I do see a lot of this, a lot of the Bergsonian preoccupation with, especially this idea of the retaining the pre-individual state into the individuated being. It's similar to, in a different way, to Bergson's discussion of the past and the present, and of being not losing anything. Like there's no memory for him is always preserved, right? So there's never a point at which, and I guess in the Simondonian terms, like information is lost, and what we experience is that loss, or that void, or that, I think Simondon calls them the extreme terms that don't have an initial relationship with each other. That is kind of, it's still it's a product of the individuating procedure, and it's not an a priori state where things are just not related. So I think it's really interesting, and it's really helpful for thinking through this stuff.
So the other criticism that that Simondon makes in this passage, or that Garelli is invoking in this passage, is the criticism of the hylomorphic schema, which again we'll see in more detail when we get to the introduction. But the general criticism is that the hylomorphic schema, it starts from form and matter, but it doesn't give an account of the interaction of form and matter. So he analyzes the example later in the book of the formation of a brick. So it involves taking clay and putting it into a mold, and pressing it and so on. So those are the two half chains. There's a chain proceeding from the form and the chain proceeding from the matter, and then there's this obscure middle zone, which the hylomorphic schema doesn't explain what the interaction between the two consists in. And so Simondon wants to instead start from that middle zone rather than leaving it obscure. And then we also have, right towards the end of that long paragraph, we have this is more the contribution of Garelli rather than of Simondon, but applying the same notion of the formation of structure through transductive processes to artistic creation. So we did see some discussion of artistic creation in the last part of the mode of existence of technical objects, for those who were there. But it wasn't developed in quite these terms of the formation of structure through transductive processes. But this is a sort of extension of Simondon's conceptual framework to apply to artistic creation. All right, we can go on to the next paragraph, or next couple paragraphs that someone else would like to read.
Is this methodological consequences?
Yes, from there.
Okay. Methodological consequences of this dispute. Such is the radical novelty of Gilbert Simondon's problematic, which will allow us to conceive in terms of transduction the processes of differentiations that are deployed starting from a metastable pre-individual system, wrought with tensions of which the individual is one of the phases of deployment. It's in this context that the notions of potential charge, oriented tensions, supersaturation, and phase shift, borrowed from thermodynamics and the notion of resonance internal to systems, intervene. According to this perspective, instead of reducing ontogenesis to the dimension restricted to and derived from the genesis of the individual, it is a question of conferring onto it the vaster characteristic of the becoming of being, that through which the being becomes insofar as it is qua being. The ontological dimension of the problem is reinforced in the care with which Simondon emphasizes the incompetence of the principle of identity and of the excluded middle, formed in a perspective of substantialistic and identitarian logic of the individuated being in order to deal with the problematic of pre-individuated being. This is why Gilbert Simondon can declare unity, which is characteristic of the individuated being, and identity, which authorizes the usage of the principle of the excluded middle, do not apply to pre-individual being, which explains why the world cannot be recomposed after the fact with monads, even by adding other principles like sufficient reason in order to organize these monads into a universe. This reference to Leibniz, as well as references to the pre-Socratic philosophers and to Plato and Aristotle, attest to the philosophical breadth of the debate that is irreducible to a strictly physicalist attitude. Not only does Gilbert Simondon justify the philosophical usage of notions borrowed from thermodynamics as a part of a paradigm shift, he deftly accounts for the historical methodological reasons that have boxed the ancients into alternative trenches established between being and becoming, movement and rest, substantial stability and chaotic instability.
Yeah, I think we can stop there to discuss.
I think there's a lot of correspondence between the Process Philosophical Project, which is in at least the Anglophone incarnation, a kind of recapitulation of a kind of Leibnizian monadic process philosophy. So I think there is probably a lot of possibility of a good, productive dialogue between people engaged in like a more generalist project of process philosophy in Simondon's work.
I pasted in chat the next sort of meaningful footnote that was on that section, footnote 12. The ancients only knew stability and instability, rest and movement, but they did not know metastability. It is therefore possible to define this metastable state of being, which is quite different from stable equilibrium and rest, and which the ancients couldn't establish in the search for the principle of individuation because they lacked a clear physical paradigm that could clarify its utilization.
Yeah, that's a quote from Simondon from this book in the introduction, which we'll get to eventually. But that's Simondon's justification or basis for borrowing the notion of metastability from the physical sciences, or his reasoning for why ancient philosophy did not have this notion of metastability because it didn't appear in the physical science of the ancients. So it has to be it has to be borrowed from contemporary physical science and then taken into philosophy.
This next section feels helpful for starting to establish some principles. Unless anyone has some thoughts.
Yeah, I think we can go ahead to the next one.
Right, so sorry, we just ended at sufficient reason. Yeah. This reference to, sorry.
No, yeah, we had that paragraph for the next one.
Yeah. However, three givens intervene in the comprehension of the metastable equilibrium with which thermodynamics has familiarized us and which Simondon introduces into his problematic in a very original way. First, we must consider the potential energy of a system. Second, we must consider the notion of order of magnitude and of different scales within the system. Third, we must consider the increase of entropy, which corresponds to the energetic degradation of the system and implies the resolution of initial potentiality. Thus, the apprehension of individualizing forms is a correlate of the progressive degradation of potential energy. A so-called completed form, which is a stabilized energy, corresponds to the highest degree of negentropy. Should I continue or?
Yeah, I think maybe read the next paragraph and then the quote.
Okay. Guided by this paradigm, which is borrowed from thermodynamics and not from the physics of fixed substance that ignores the problem of energy, as the concepts of classical philosophy confirm, particularly with the idea of res extensa, Simondon will attempt to think the order of a being's pre-individuality in terms of supersaturated potential charges within a metastable system, on the basis of which the degradation of energy sequential to a state of overtension of the system will produce processes of differentiations and individuations. Thus, it is by phase shifting that a metastable system charged with a supersaturated energetic potential individualizes, while also simultaneously spouting, from its not yet individualized internal tensions, a profusion of individualizing forms, which afterwards are capable of being structured into further systems and reforming into new metastable equilibria. Consequently, according to Simon's expression, every operation and every relation within an operation is an individuation that splits and phase shifts pre-individual being, all while correlating the extreme values in magnitude, which are initially without mediation. I'm just going to read this paragraph because it's really short, and I think it helps. This is a situation that confers onto relations a charge of being that exceeds and overflows the order of strictly logical knowledge and significations, and it allows us to avoid the dualism between the act of abstract intellectual knowledge and the inert objects on which the cognitive act bears.
Right, that last paragraph was the point that I mentioned earlier, that transduction is both an ontological and a logical process. So it's both something that is a real process occurring in the world, and also part of the operation of knowledge of the world. So that it's both at the same time. And the second point there in that same paragraph is this relativization, I guess you could say, of logical knowledge. So this is what I earlier referred to as conceptual knowledge. So that a knowledge that would proceed through concepts, and then concepts in the proper sense, or as Simone is using the term, is are correlated with already individuated beings. So in order to have a grasp of transduction, we have to proceed through this knowledge, which is not conceptual in that sense.
Right. This reminds me of the section on the mode of existence of technical objects, where he makes a distinction that's kind of related to this. Between internal to knowledge, he distinguishes between speculative and I believe operational knowledge, and I think that this relates to this kind of claim here about the kind of difference between the kind of formal knowledge placement and the kind of substrative nature of knowledge. I think that this kind of speaks to that kind of distinction, I guess. I don't know. That's the only place I can kind of trace it to, because he does make epistemic claims in that book, but they're kind of few and far between in that kind of direct way. So that was a very striking distinction that he made between the operational knowing and speculative knowing.
Right. I believe, I'm just trying to remember, that distinction had to do with the knowledge that, or the form of knowledge that comes about through technical processes, or the technical mode of existence. So you have a knowledge of the working of various technical processes. And then on the other hand, there's the knowledge which is sort of formalized out of the religious mode of existence. And science in the proper sense is the conjunction of those two forms of knowledge for Simondon, or two procedures, I guess you can say.
Yeah, I do think that he wants to kind of draw a connection in the kind of epistemic or meta-epistemic domain to this kind of figure ground alternative to the form substance hylomorphism of classical philosophy. And I think that this is kind of his attempt of doing that, to kind of show that there is this difference between the figure of the knowing and the ground on which what is known is known, which, oh, didn't realize that you disconnected.
Sorry, 61, were you saying that there is or there isn't a difference there? I missed that.
Between the hylomorphic model and the figure-ground relation, or?
When you were saying about the difference between knowing and the process.
Well, I was just thinking that that the figure ground relation is what he wants to bring attention to within the domain of epistemology, when he kind of models the operational knowledge versus speculative knowledge distinction on the kind of technical versus religious domain, which he associates very strongly with both the figure ground relation and the subject object distinction.
Yeah, I would highly encourage anyone who wants to learn more about Simon Doan's epistemology to read part 3 of On the Motive Existence of Technical Objects, as well as the conclusion, because so that part of the book is a sort of philosophical anthropology, where he gives a genetic account of various modes of existence, modes of human being in the world, and how they arise from each other, and it's sort of structured by the figure ground distinction, and which coincides with the distinction between the individuated beings and the pre-individual from which they're individuated. And yeah, so if you want to learn more about Simon Doan's epistemology, go through that part of the book.
I like here how the Garelli's introduce phase shifting and stuff, because this is the beginning. We've kind of been talking about all the critiques, but this is the beginning of Simone introducing how does Simone try to solve these problems, and just the shifting from like, you know, he talks about the idea of the Kleineman and stuff like that earlier. Like, there's a way in which in the pre-individual state, there's, I think the phrase he uses, there's like an incompatibility with itself, and there's already kind of like there's the problem of identity that doesn't exist for Simondon there, and then phase shifting, like there's the idea of potential energy existing within that incompatibility needing to be resolved through phase shifts feels like it's his attempt to solve this problem of you know, again, it's the phase shifting is kind of continuous, always happening. Yeah, I don't want to misspeak, but basically just that we're finally getting some terms to talk about how does becoming happen to being, but what is the becoming of being, and how does it proceed, I guess.
Yeah, so we saw a couple paragraphs ago the thesis that pre-individual being is not characterized by unity or the law of excluded middle. So he's going to define, or he's going to claim that pre-individual being is superior to unity in the sense that it contains some sort of multiplicity within it. It's not homogeneous. So the pre-individual field is structured by potentials of various kinds, out of which structures will arise in individuation. And then it's through this phase shift it's that the pre-individual being sort of separates out into individuated components. Right, so I think we can go on to the next bit, starting, how is this pitfall avoided?
I can go again. How is this pitfall avoided? First, by conferring a dimension of being onto the relations traditionally treated in strictly logical terms, as can be seen at work in the classical theories of deduction and induction. Second, by treating the operation of transduction in conjunction with that of individualizing form-taking, which manifests the passage from the pre-individual metastable field to individuations in formation. Let's examine the first point. The relations between the fields of extreme tensions of the metastable system, charged with potentiality, have the status of being, to the extent that their differential values between what can no longer be qualified by pre-existing terms are not yet individualized, but correspond to the dimensions and scales of tensions from which the resolving energy of the system emerges. According to this perspective, quote, relation does not spring forth between two terms that would already be individuals. Relation is an aspect of the internal resonance of a system of individuation. It belongs to a system state. This living being, which is both more and less than unity, conveys an interior problematic and can enter as an element into a problematic that is vaster than its own being. For the individual, participation is the fact of being an element in a vaster individuation through the intermediary of the charge of pre-individual reality that the individual contains, i.e. due to the potentials that it harbors. Simone's emphasis.
So this was something that I think Alyosha mentioned earlier, the thesis that relation has the status of being. So the relation, so Simone will take this as a definition of relation. So relation in the proper sense has the status of being. It's something that it's not, there isn't a relation between two previously individuated beings or already individuated beings. It's only in a system undergoing individuation that there is relation in this proper sense, which has the status of being.
I think that the living being is both more and less than unity. It's a very telling line.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's neither closed or totally closed or totally open in a sense. So that there has to be this closing at some point, but a living system is always semi-open, so to speak. So it's very selective in its affectability, so to speak, and its sensibility, what it can produce in relation to chemical products that are upholding its homeostasis, but also in attaching meaning to its surroundings, what is meaningful to it and how it interacts with its surroundings. And by that, the Umwelt, the surroundings, are also in a very activistic and and expanded cognition state of mind part of this system, so to speak, because there cannot be an organism without any relations to its surroundings.
I think too that there's kind of a double openness, in the sense that the surroundings are both kind of exterior and interior in this formulation. And so it seems to be kind of opened in its like informative, I guess the what would be the kind of cause, what would cause certain, I'm not sure what words to use yet. I feel like I need to read more of the text before I can explain this. I don't want to give like a top-down formulation. But it seems like it's open both in like the input side and the output side, right? It's like open-ended both, and both in an inner sense and an external sense. And this concept of like the openness to the surroundings, I think, is like always a kind of double openness in that regards, unless you conceive of the inner and the outer as like a false problem, I suppose.
He does talk about interiority and exteriority, and that comes up a bit more in the psychosocial. So I don't think you're wrong, actually. And it really strikes me as very anti-Oedipus-y, because he starts to talk about the molar and molecular and the ways in which, I guess in the Deleuzian language, you'd say the one invests the other and already exists sort of like in the molecular. It's not like the molar doesn't exist there. It exists as its limit or horizon or whatever. Not that we should read all this through the lens of Deleuze, but I think that you can very clearly see where some of these ideas came from.
Yeah, but there's this reciprocal nature between both, and they're not sharply distinguished from each other. I guess that's more of the point. These are not strict borders between the inside and the outside, but the borders are constantly shifting, and the inside can become an outside, and vice versa, depending on how complex a system becomes. If systems are verging or diverging and becoming maybe two different systems, so to speak. And also there's in systems theory this aspect that the surrounding of every system can also be just be constituted by other systems, or be just other systems, so to speak. So there's this kind of overlapping, and I guess the concept of the milieu is very, but I'm not quite sure if Simondon is ever talking about the milieu. It's more like a term that Canguilhem is using.
I know that Simondon does use milieu in the technical the milieu of the technical object in its evolution.
Okay, thank you.
But it doesn't come up as much as I'd like it to be. I think I'd have to look at Canguilhem.
Yeah, the notion of the milieu is always, even when it's not sort of explicitly made reference to, I think it's always present in his discussion of vital individuation, or the individuation of living beings. So the individuation in general is always a partial process for Simondon. There's always the pre-individual always remains. There's always something of the pre-individual even after the process of individuation, and it's through this remaining pre-individual that there's this relation between a living being, for example, and their environment, the milieu, so this relationship in the living being, it's the pre-individual is both internal to the living being and also in its milieu. So it's that's why there's this sense of the double the double sense of openness that we were talking about earlier. Yeah, I think we have time for one more paragraph or a couple of paragraphs before we wrap it up.
According to the second point, transduction, in strict solidarity with the discharge of the supersaturated potential energy of a metastable system, will appear as a form-taking and, on this basis, in the conjoined, twofold topological and noetic sense as quote-unquote information. Since through the very movement in which a process of transduction, the correlated of the discharge of pre-individual potential energy of a metastable system topologically informs, quote-unquote, a structure, which is given to be witnessed and to be thought, we can see that it noetically informs about what it makes appear, and according to its associated pre-individual charge, i.e. the horizon of pre-individual being from which it detaches. This is why transduction, in contrast with induction and deduction, which do not have the status of being but are strictly logical relations exterior to the pre-existing terms that they link up, manifest as never exterior to the terms that it brings forth, according to a twofold dimension of thought and of being. As an individualizing movement of knowledge, but also a movement of being, transduction is a form-taking in conjunction with the energy discharge of the metastable system that is revealed as being more than unity and more than identity. On this basis, transduction is therefore not merely the reasoning of the mind. It is also intuition, because it is that through which a structure appears in a domain of a problematic as providing the resolution to the problem posed. But contrary to deduction, transduction does not go elsewhere to seek a principle to resolve the problem of a domain. It extracts the resolving structure from the very tensions of the domain. Just as a supersaturated solution crystallizes due to its own potentials and according to the chemical nature that it holds, not with the contribution of some foreign form. It is in this sense that transduction is a discovery of dimensions, whose system makes those of each of the terms communicate, such that the complete reality of each of the terms of the domain can become organized into new discovered structures without loss or reduction.
Triad, I'm not wrong this time. This is absolutely connected to Bergson. It feels like an expansion of the idea, like whereas Bergson was accused of a kind of spiritualism and of vagueness for like, oh, what does intuition really mean? Is this just some kind of like supernatural sense? And I think he does a good job of defining it as his own distinct kind of metaphysics and whatnot. But ironically, it's as though Simondon is right in that for Bergson's time and for all his brilliance, that he lacked a kind of paradigm shift that could have inspired the kind of language that Simondon is now using to talk about what does the actual procedure of intuition look like. Well, it is about like entering, in a Bergsonian language, you would probably say entering into the duration of the thing, of actually trying to perceive its, the way that the structures resolve themselves rather than trying to come with a priori concepts and immobilize them, switching back to a Bergsonian vocabulary. So it just feels, Lou gets distracted, But it just feels very much like it's a very potent and a really, really vibrant way of expanding on a problem that was kind of always, I love my Bergson, but it feels like it's never really solved or really discussed in a satisfying way, at least so far I've read. So this feels, and the fact that it's something that is both within duration, you could say. So it's not just a conscious process. It's an epistemological, philosophical exercise, yes, but you're able to do it because you're partaking of sort of like the nature of things, of their inherent flow, trying to enter into that transductive relationship yourself, which is why it's not simply a form of knowledge, I guess.
I think one thing that I think is a good way to at least kind of model conceptually, tentatively, a distinction between Bergson and Simondon is to think about like the kind of phasal structure that Simondon introduces in relation to Bergsonian duration as a kind of movement from duration centeredness to frequency centeredness. The frequency being the kind of like ergoticization of the duration notion, the kind of idea that we can like through its like repeatability and its synchronic kind of overlapping with other frequencies, we can kind of differentiate. I mean by ergoticism a kind of I guess it's from the kind of like work path idea, but it's used in kind of statistics a lot. And I'm kind of trying to use it in a double meaning in a sense. So it's kind of taking the duration to task, right? To kind of say like, well, where are the points of at one end and the other and connecting them. And then you have this kind of phasal structure in a sense. But I'm not super familiar with Bergson. I read his metaphysics, but I kind of zoned out most of the time while I was reading it. I remember a lot that it had to do with circles.
So we have here in this paragraph again, coming back to this notion of transduction as both an operation, an ontological process, and a logical process or a process of thought. And he's going to say in the introduction of the book, he says that knowledge of transduction is a transduction in knowledge. So our knowledge undergoes a process of individuation itself, and that's how we have knowledge of the process of individuation. So it has both, it plays both roles at the same time.
Similar to Hegel's phenomenological arguments, like it both applies to epistemology and to metaphysics, right? It's that and that line of explanatory interest where both apply to. I think any real significantly interesting arguments have implications for both, right? I don't know. That's probably just my perspective.
Yeah, I think we're just about at time now. It's been about 2 hours. We started around 7 after roughly, so we don't want to go beyond that because we can only put 2 hours up on YouTube, I think, which is where we're putting our recordings. So we can end here for today, and then we'll pick up. I think we should be able to finish the foreword and then start the introduction next time. So thank you everyone for coming and for your contributions. And if you have other questions or comments, you can put them in the follow-up questions channel or ongoing discussion, or and then we'll bring them up next time as well.